Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. I'm Professor Christopher Jain Miller, and I'm very pleased today to have our guest, Professor Frank Rogers Jr., who is the Muriel Bernice Roberts Professor of Spiritual Formation and Narrative Pedagogy at Claremont School of Theology, as well as the co-founder and co-director of the Center for Engaged Compassion there at Claremont School of Theology. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Frank Rogers.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's a real honor to be a part of this whole series. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, I was particularly really looking forward to interviewing you because, we are a Jain-founded institution, but of course, the Jain tradition is very, very interested and open to learning from other religious traditions and the truths and teachings of other religious traditions. And you bring a very, very nice worldview to us here that we'll talk about in your class, coming from the monotheistic spiritual traditions of the West. And so we'll get into talking about that, into what you teach, into what you research, into a course that you're going to be teaching for the Compassion Studies Initiative at Arihanta Institute soon. So before we get into all that, I would like our listeners to get a chance to know you, who you are. You could tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you teach, and what and why you research compassion in particular.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Chris. So yeah, I teach at the Claremont School of Theology in Southern California, the United States. It's an interreligious school of theology. We have students from all manner of spiritual traditions who come and study with us. And there I teach in the area of spirituality and compassion studies primarily. And I also co-direct the Center for Engaged Compassion. And what our center is most interested in is how do we actually cultivate compassion? All spiritual traditions say that compassion is really at the heartbeat of what we consider to be sacred or the ways in which we seek to live aligned spiritually. But there's not lots of attention to how do you actually cultivate compassion, certainly in the Western spiritual traditions. And so we've really focused on that and teach workshops and classes for spiritual seekers on cultivating compassion for ourselves and for others. We also work with organizations to help bring compassion into their company culture. In the last several years, we've been working with communities that are really polarized and divided politically or socially, and how compassionate listening and dialogue can help bridge some of our differences. That's been a huge, huge need in North America for sure these last years. And the research that we do in that feeds into the teaching. So at the school where I teach compassion studies, I teach contemplative spiritualities, I teach compassion, social engagement, and how compassion really can fuel transformative social justice movements. And then one of our bread and butter signature courses is how compassion can help cultivate personal restoration, how self-compassion and tending to the wounds and suffering that we carry within us can help us heal and become whole and live out of the deep essence that we all want to live out of. And so compassionate approaches to self-healing and self-restoration is really at the core of what I teach as well.
Yeah, that's really inspiring because so much of the work that you do and so much of what you teach and the research you do really focuses on compassion some way in action and putting it into practice either for oneself and or for the world. And I also really appreciate this emphasis on self-compassion because I think it is difficult to be compassionate when we aren't first compassionate with ourselves, as you say, in the trauma that we are carrying around. And so students really will be able to learn so much from you with regard to both the way they treat themselves as well as the way that they treat one another. And I do find it particularly timely what you are teaching, given all the manifold forms of polarization and really lack of compassion around the world right now. And as you say, in North America and around everything that's happening there. So I really feel like that this pedagogy, which, as you say, all the world religions really have some form of compassion and approaches to compassion, will be so beneficial for so many of our listeners to learn about from you today, and can help heal a world that needs compassion more than ever. One thing, Frank, that I noticed when I was preparing to interview you, we are, of course, colleagues at Claremont School of Theology. I'm a visiting professor there with you, and I know you've been there for a long time. And as I was going through my feed on social media, one of the nice things I saw, it's so hard on social media these days, is that your recent book, Cradled in the Arms of Compassion, won an award. And this was a more recent book, I believe. It's not the one we're using in the class, but can you tell us a little bit about your book, Cradled in the Arms of Compassion, and this book award that you recently won?
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you, Chris. So this book, it just came out last October, and it's a very personal book. It's really kind of the spiritual autobiography, the journey of my own recovery. I'm a survivor of childhood abuse, and so I really kind of tell the story of how I sought resources both in psychotherapeutic context, but also in spiritual context. I was really very much a spiritual seeker, trying to find resources to heal the cacophony, the internal cacophonies and relational challenges that I experienced by virtue of being a survivor of abuse, and discovered along the way some really compassion-based approaches to tending to the inner wounds within me and the chaos that was driving me, to really help me kind of a way to heal and recover. And so, Cradled in the Arms of Compassion is subtitled "The Spiritual Journey from Trauma to Recovery." Really tells the story of that healing journey. And it was really graced to just receive the Best Religion Book Award for 2024 from the American Book Festival, which was a deep honor. A lot of very notable authors have received that award, including Pope Francis, which I was bemused to see. I'm standing in interesting company, good company, in that way. So so thank you for mentioning that, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Congratulations. I didn't know that Pope Francis had also been awarded this award. And so you're standing in a circle of some pretty incredible authors there, it sounds like, with Cradled in the Arms of Compassion. And I also note, just hearing you talk about it in the subtitle there, that this is a book about self-compassion in a lot of ways, being cradled in compassion and also having compassion for oneself as you navigated that journey. I look forward to reading that book at some point, Frank. You know how we scholars are always having a pile of books to read, but that one is particularly calling me right now as we're talking about compassion, self-compassion, and what compassion means. And that's really what I wanted to ask you as we started this interview. You said bits and pieces about it as we've gone through and had some introductions, but what does compassion mean to you?
Yeah, for me, compassion is really being moved by the experience of another and accessing like a warm regard within us for that person, such that we want to respond to them in ways that intend to ease their suffering a bit or to promote their flourishing. And so it's a fundamental spiritual energy of connection with other people, but also in connection with our own internal world, with parts of ourselves as well. But I think of it as a fundamental a spiritual energy of warm connection that we feel when we really take the time to see another and be moved by what is going on in that person's experience.
What a beautiful way of describing it, as both this kind of internal experience and an internal experience that's responding to something that we are experiencing with someone else. So it's very relational and has to do with the way that we really interact with others who are suffering or need some kind of support. So I suppose a lot of the challenge then is, how do you put that into practice in each and every situation in which you experience that, right? Because there's so much suffering around the world, so many people who are really, I think, craving compassion and maybe not even know that they're craving that compassion. And really so much of the work that you do seems to focus on how to cultivate that And I'm really excited about the course that you're going to be teaching in the Compassion Studies Initiative, because it's going back to another book of yours, an earlier book of yours, Compassion in Practice, I believe is the title of the book. And that really focuses on how to put this in practice in particular ways, both for yourself and for the world around you. So the course that you're going to be teaching is titled Spiritual Approaches to Cultivating Compassion. And yeah, why don't you tell us a little bit kind of overview of what this course is about and why you chose to teach this particular way?
Yeah, so this course is really an overview of how compassion can be cultivated through monotheistic religious traditions primarily. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism have been deeply, deeply formative for me, and for those traditions, compassion cultivation, it really is kind of threefold. I mean, there is this sense that there is a spiritual presence that sustains all of the universe, that is, often referred to as God, whatever that cosmic force field of love and compassion that interconnects all of us. And for cultivating compassion in these traditions, it's really about helping us to access and a sense of being held in a sacred, cosmic, compassionate source in which we feel ourselves seen and heard and held and cradled, where our wounds are tended and our own flourishing is cultivated. And out of the abundance of that, and accessing capacities to be able to extend compassion to ourselves, so that we can treat ourselves in ways that promote our own flourishing and help us to access the streams of compassion that do dwell within each of us. And then out of that, being able to extend compassion towards the people in our lives, everyone from the people in our families to our kin, to our neighbors, to strangers, to those who are suffering. But also in these monotheistic traditions, it's a pretty radical call that we are invited to extend compassion even to people that we disagree with, people that we find ourselves polarized with, people who we would even call enemies, to love our enemies. And so it's a radical invitation to this threefold dimension of compassion, being rooted in a sacred, compassionate source, being restored with self-compassion, and then extending compassion towards others, including the people that we find most challenging and difficult in our lives.
Wonderful. Yes. And I really like how the way that your language here sort of universalizes it in a way, keeping it rooted in the Western monotheistic spiritual traditions, but describing it as this kind of sacred source that we all have access to, and we're all kind of invited to experience and embody. And from that space, it sounds like, move towards compassion for ourselves and compassion for our neighbors. And as you said, compassion for one's enemies, which, in other traditions that I teach, in the Jain tradition and things like this, it's often said that you should extend compassion to those who suffer. That's almost it goes without saying, but it is even explicitly said in these traditions and yoga traditions as well. But when it comes to one's enemies, that's often a more difficult challenge, I think. Those we don't agree with, or those who we perceive to be against us, or we perceive ourselves to be against, finding some common ground and even finding compassion for those who are suffering but are not exactly open per se, or may not seem open to compassion, but probably need it. So that was one of the things I also really appreciated about this course. And I know we'll get into talking about that more as we go through some of the things you'll be teaching, because these are some of the, I guess you could say, the main topics of your course. And as I go through it, for example, in the first class, this is a 4-part class you're teaching. The first part is titled Cultivating Connection with a Compassionate Sacred Source. So here you are starting with this compassionate sacred source. Why is it important for us to start there looking at that compassionate sacred source?
Yeah, well, because Western traditions, and this would be proven out by contemporary science as well, like Dan Siegel's interpersonal neurobiology or attachment theory, helps us recognize that unless we have experienced some love, our spirits wither. We need to be experience love as much as we need food. Our bodies need food or air or water. That if without some sense that we have been met and seen and recognized and honored, we would wither away. We would become depressed. We would become dysfunctional. And so, to be honest, to the extent that any of us are functional at all in the world is testimony that somewhere along the way, we have been seen, we have been recognized. There has been some source that has helped us to be able to experience ourselves as being loved and met and honored. And so the first invitation for cultivating compassion is becoming rooted in those living streams of where we have experienced that love, and whether that is through family members or benefactors. John McCransky, the Buddhist teacher, calls these benefactors of the soul, the people who have extended compassion to us, when we were young or even when we are adults, and that these are like icons of little portals of that cosmic spiritual source of compassion that sustains all of the universe. And so kind of reconnecting with those sources within us that help us be refreshed with a sense of our own worth and dignity and belovedness is the ground out of which we are able then to allow living streams of compassion to fill us and flow out towards others. This would be how Western spiritual traditions would recognize that.
Yeah, I really like the intersections with science as well. I think this make sense to people who may not even be familiar with some of these Western spiritual traditions who might be taking this course, that there's this scientific backing for some of the things you're saying about connecting with this source and what our early childhood experiences may or may not have provided for us that would allow us to feel self-compassion, feel worth, and be able, as you say, to function. So many people, I think, experience trauma in various forms early on in life that prevent them from having that self-love and that self-compassion. And for what it sounds like in this class one is that this sacred source, this compassionate sacred source, if nothing else, is the sacred source of any experience of compassion that one may have had, and is also accessible, from what I'm hearing and reading in your syllabus, is accessible to anyone, whether or not they were lucky enough to have that compassion from outside sources when they were a child. Am I understanding you there correctly?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And that's one of the invitations that we'll do in this class is to give everyone the opportunity to kind of reflect back on, where have been those moments and spaces in our own lives where we have experienced some measure of compassion or connection that was life-sustaining for us, and allowing ourselves to kind of remember and reconnect with that, because that is just spiritually a renewing in and of itself. Whether we call it sacred or not, it could be from a very mundane source. It's still spiritually sustaining and revitalizing.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, as you're describing that, I'm thinking back on my own life and some of the people. I'm thinking of my grandfather. I was talking with Nitin Shah, who's also teaching a course in the Compassion Studies Initiative. We were sharing some stories about our grandfathers. Grandparents are often people who make you feel this at a young age and really make you feel loved and held, and this compassion. And everybody has somebody different, but it's really that is so sustaining. And to imagine this kind of source from which all of that is coming is really sort of inspiring to think about. That it's almost unlimited in a sense. And some of us have these various ways that we had experienced that in our earlier years. And part of what the direction you take this then in this course is that you go from this compassionate sacred source, and then you start to talk about people's true self as inherently compassionate, which seems to make sense. If there's the sacred compassionate source to which we are all connected, or could potentially be connected if we don't feel we are, or access in some way, that our true self would also be inherently compassionate, if I'm following the logic correctly here. Can you tell us a little bit about this? What is the true self? What does it mean to say that the true self is inherently compassionate?
Yeah, right. Well, so from Western spiritual traditions, the recognition is that we are all made in the image of the sacred. that we all have within us some spark of that divine, and it's kind of like a pilot light of the soul, that this inner flame that is always present in every single human being, that is a spiritual essence where our greatest capacities reside. And when we come back home to ourself, when we are back centered in who we were created to be, we are connected with one another. We feel resilient. We feel calm in the midst of challenging circumstances, and we have access for compassion in radical ways. And different mystics in Western traditions will call that the true self, or the imago Dei. It may be similar to other spiritual traditions, kind of the Buddha nature that resides in all human beings, or Atman, this spiritual core, this spiritual essence that dwells in every human being, where our capacities for love and resilience reside. And so another invitation in cultivating compassion is helping persons access that spiritual essence within us, help us to come back home to our highest self, our best self, our deepest self, where our capacities for compassion are more organically available to us. When I'm calm and centered and kind of in my best self, I'm much more open to people. I'm much more, able to recognize folks and more responsive to people's needs around me. But when I'm driven and moody, I don't have as easy access to my core of compassion. And so helping us access that spiritual essence is one of the invitations that we'll explore.
Wonderful. Yes, I'm glad that you also brought up the comparison to Buddhism and Hinduism with Atman. And then in the Jain tradition, we have Jiva, which is the true self, so to speak. I mean, often translated with a capital S, as the true self. And there's such an overlap in terms of the interreligious significance of this, of what it means in all of these traditions and in yoga traditions as well, to be connected to that true self, however you get yourself there. And there's so many methods in so many ways. From that place is where we really can be our truest and most compassionate and best version of ourselves, we might say. Often after I go to yoga class and meditation, I feel like I'm in touch with that part of myself that sometimes can get lost in everyday life if you're not really trying to stay attuned to it, right? And I'm speaking personally from my own experience practicing yoga, meditation, and various things in the Jain tradition, but I'm sure that there are also practices that are not dissimilar, embodied practices within monotheistic Western traditions that can tap you into that sort of, if we want to put it in scientific terms, that neurological balance that we need to be able to really act from our most compassionate place and our truest place. So I'm really hearing that come out here. And one of the things you note in this second class that I wanted to ask you about, Frank, and feel free to comment on anything that I just said, but is that you said you're going to help students understand what compassion is, but also how it's distinct from empathy. Do you want to say something about that and what you mean by that?
Yeah. So this is something that we really emphasize as well, because I think there's a confusion often between empathy and compassion. Even to the point where we may heard the notion of compassion fatigue, that when we spend too much time having compassion for others, it actually can lead to burnout and fatigue. And I really think that's a misnomer. I don't think compassion leads to fatigue. I think actually compassion is a restorative spiritual energy. What leads to fatigue really is too much empathy. And so the difference here is empathy is when we experience the experience of another person that we're observing. So I see somebody's pain, somebody who is in pain, I wince, I go, oh my gosh, that must just be so painful. And what is happening there is I am tapping into my own experience of being in a pain that feels similar to the pain that I am observing. In fact, Tanya Singer, who is a neuroscientist, one of the leading scientific experts on measuring empathy and compassion. She has recognized her big claim to fame was she recognized doing MRI studies on people who have empathy. When we see somebody in pain, when we are empathic, the part of our brain that lights up is the part of our brain where I experience a similar form of pain. And so it's really accessing the pain receptacles in my body, which can be very, very distressing. And so what empathy is, it's kind of like an attunement where an alignment, like a tuning fork. There's pain on one side of one person, and then a similar pain is being experienced on the other. And there's a little emotional resonance there because there's two forms of pain that are being experienced side by side. And that resonance can feel like, okay, yeah, you get it. I mean, you really understand. You experience something similar. But if we stay within our own pain receptacles, we're just going to start accessing it's going to release cortisol in our bodies and eventually lead to lower immune systems and whatnot. What compassion is when we experience the pain of another person, but then we transform that pain receptacle in our own experience into a warm, loving regard, much like a parent will feel towards a baby, which releases oxytocin in our systems as opposed to cortisol and adrenaline. Oxytocin being kind of the love hormone, and that is a restorative energy of warmth. When we see our beloved smiling at us and we smile in return, oxytocin is being released in us, and so the experience of compassion is moving from a pain response to somebody suffering into this warm, restorative, loving regard that then responds in some acts of kindness. And at the end of a day of experiencing compassion, say on a hospital ward, if you were a chaplain, you'd come home and you'd be tired, but it'd be the good kind of tired, like you'd been in like a night of dancing or vigorous exercising, and your body needs to rest, but it's in a restored energy. Whereas if you spend a day just feeling empathy for people, just seeing people's pain and feeling that pain in yourself, one after another, you're going to come home and you're going to be fatigued. You're going to be weary. Like, oh my gosh, I dread having to go back to work. I can't stand one more person that I have to try to meet in their suffering. It's because it's accessing the pain response systems of our brain as opposed to the calm and connection parts of our brain. So that distinction is a very important distinction when people are trying to cultivate compassion.
Wow. That was really, for me, so eye-opening just to hear you describe it this way. And I find it so fascinating. People often say compassion and empathy are not the same thing, and you hear people talk about this, but to hear the kind of physiological, psychological, and neurological underpinnings of what we're describing here as empathy versus compassion really helps give me, and probably our listeners as well, language and an scientific understanding around which to frame and understand these precise experiences you're having. I'm just thinking of flipping through the media, through social media or through the news, and seeing so much pain and having those literal physiological responses to what I'm seeing versus, as you say, if I'm with a neighbor or I'm visiting someone in the hospital or someone is hurting and just needs to talk, there's a different kind of feeling that emerges when you're able to be with that in a way that you come away feeling, as you say, yes, you have given energy, but in a way that's not causing your immune system and your cortisol and everything to go haywire. And I do see in the syllabus that you even have readings from neuroscience from Tanya Singer. You mentioned Tanya Singer there. So students will be able to read about the science behind what you're saying. I know you're not just making this up, is what I'm saying. You've cited your sources here. And really, Frank, that's really, really fascinating that students will be able to distinguish between empathy and compassion in such a profound way in your class. And I suspect that when they get to the third part of this class, cultivating self-compassion and compassion-based personal healing, that it's probably grounded in a lot of what you've talked about in class 1 and class 2, because now we're talking about how we cultivate compassion towards ourselves and heal ourselves through compassion. What do you mean by that? What does it mean to cultivate self-compassion and compassion-based personal healing?
when we are in our true self or that best self and we're grounded, compassion feels accessible and it feels easy. The problem is that we're often not in that grounded true self space. We're often driven by emotions. We get reactive, we get irritable, we get moody, we have fear and anxiety that kind of takes over our inner system, or we're driven by impulses to surf the internet or binge on ice cream or on Netflix. And we are internally kind of enslaved to these internal emotions and impulses that dislodge us from our deepest core, our spiritual essence. And what's unique about our approach to compassion cultivation is that usually when we are kind of hijacked by emotions, fear, anxiety, anger, or whatnot, a lot of spiritual practices would try to cultivate just a different emotional experience and essentially kind of suppress those feeling states, or try to let them go and let them kind of pass away like clouds floating on the wind and just leave our system. What we recognize is that usually doesn't work very well. It's kind of like trying to push a buoy underwater. When I'm feeling angry, to tell myself, I really shouldn't be angry. I'm a spiritual person. Just kind of get over this anger or just kind of let it go. It just kind of escalates the anger in me. That the anger is like, no, I'm still ticked off about whatever's happening. And so what we've discovered. And these are currents in Western spiritual traditions, but also in some contemporary psychotherapeutic modalities, is a recognition that all of these internal states, these emotions or impulses, they emerge in us for a reason. They are rooted in some deep need that is yearning to be recognized and tended to. We might think of it as each one of these is a cry of the soul, rooted in some type of suffering that is aching for relief or aching for some type of restoration. So instead of judging ourselves for the impulses and feelings that we have, and instead of trying to suppress them or let them go or talk ourselves out of them with affirmations to try to bulk up a more positive emotional experience, this invitation is, what if they tended to these interior emotions and impulses with curiosity and with compassion? What if we tried to listen to what is the deep cry underneath the angers or the fears or the deep need underneath the drivenness, and try to hear what is really at stake within us and what is aching for recognition or healing or restoration? And when we hear that, our own heart opens to ourselves. I have compassion for, that's why I'm so irritable right now. That's why I'm experiencing anxiety. And we can tend to that deeper cry in the soul with compassion in a way that restores us back to our best self. And for us, this becomes kind of a precondition for cultivating compassion towards others. If I'm actually irritable towards somebody, instead of trying to fake my way and force a feigned experience of compassion towards someone else, we say the first invitation is to take a U-turn and say, okay, wait a minute, I'm feeling irritable right now, or I'm feeling self-protective. Let me listen to where that is coming from within myself and hear the deep need and the deep cry. Extend compassion to that in a way that I get regrounded in my best self. And then I might be open to cultivating compassion towards another. And that becomes a precondition for cultivating compassion for others. So that class session will really explore this invitation to a radical form of welcoming all that happens within us with a compassionate hospitality that restores us to our best self.
So it sounds like by continually cultivating this self-compassionate, continually connecting you back to your true self, which is probably connecting you back to that compassionate source we talked about all the way back in class 1, from what I'm understanding. And in doing that through various practices, we're able to stay grounded in that and then really sincerely show up for others in a compassionate way. As you say, we don't have to fake it or force ourselves, but we really feel it, and we feel that compassion towards others, if I'm understanding you correctly there.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
It's just wonderful. There's so much focus on what's going on for us internally. And I think oftentimes that gets overlooked, particularly in secular context, not in psychology context, but just in the secular world, more broadly speaking, that we overlook what might be happening inside of us and why it's happening inside of us. And these traditions and these practices that you're pulling here are coming from psychological approaches and spiritual approaches, it seems, to be able to really interrogate that inner world of ours in a loving and self-compassionate way, to be able to be compassionate toward others, which is actually the topic then of class 4, which now everything makes so much sense to me, Frank, looking through here. Cultivating compassion towards others, from one's neighbor to one's enemy. So tell us then what we do with all of this self-compassion that we have.
Yeah. And exactly. I mean, as we, cultivate deeper and deeper connections with whatever source of compassion sustains us, and tend to ourselves with self-compassion in ways that restore us to that spiritual essence within us, that places us into a posture where we are then open towards cultivating deeper compassion towards others. And the invitation here, it's a couple things. One, it's a recognition that other people are wired in the same ways that we are. And so when we look at another person, when we take the time to just, first of all, just pay attention to another person's experience, which we don't often do in our lives, right? We so often just kind of motor through our day, driven by our own agenda, or seeing people through the lens of what I need to get done, or my own assumptions or stereotypes. And we don't often take the time to actually perceive and pay attention to another person in their own unique experience. And then when we do that, we can see them in whatever emotions they have or the impulses that drive them, and recognize that those are all cries of their soul, that they have a spiritual essence within them, just like we do. And the things that dislodge them from that essence are actually cries of their soul that are rooted in some type of suffering. And so cultivating a curiosity about what are the deep wounds within another, the deep longings, or the deep fears that drive a person, and being able to hear that opens our heart to a deeper compassionate understanding towards other people, in ways that we are moved then to respond to them. And that's easy to do, when we can cultivate that intentionally, but relatively easily to do with our neighbors or the people at, Starbucks, or, to take the time to just pay attention and notice them in their experience and extend kindness. But it gets more and more difficult with people who activate us, who trigger us, and people who activate us are, Western spiritual traditions would say, these people are actually our greatest spiritual allies, because they are activating something in me that still is untended, a wound in me that is still aching to be nurtured. And so when I get reactive to somebody else, it's an invitation that this person has accessed another place within me that is crying out for self-compassion and reconnection with a compassionate source, and then being able to tend to that, to restore myself back to my grounded essence, and then see this person for who they are, and in a more grounded and way that has more clarity. And it may be that the person is still doing something that we find offensive. It may be somebody still doing something that is egregiously violating, person who's mired in abusive behavior. And what we could do is we can be grounded in a place of genuine curiosity and compassion, recognizing that even another person's abusiveness is rooted in their suffering, in their pain. They weren't born as an abuser. And so we could have an understanding and a deep compassion, and we could reach out to that person, inviting them back into their own healing and their own highest self. But we also recognize that when they are not willing to do that, compassion also means that we need to have firm boundaries where we are protecting those who are vulnerable, and perhaps needing to sequester people who are dangerous. So compassion does not mean that we legitimate everybody's behavior. It means that we can have a deep understanding for the humanity in another person, a deep sense of tragedy at the woundedness that gives rise to really destructive behavior. but also a strength and boldness that is going to create boundaries that dangerous and destructive behavior does not hurt the wider community. And so when we do need to put boundaries around someone or sequester someone, we do it out of a sense of grief and out of a sense of pain, that the tragedy that this person's own woundedness has been so severe that they're not able to act out of their higher self. Means that we have to be strong in our boundaries, but we do that with a sense of tragedy out of the compassion that we experience for them and their humanity, and we treat them with humanity even in the midst of developing whatever boundaries are necessary and important. And that's a difficult spiritual challenge and a toggle that is part of the spiritual path that we are invited into.
I really am enjoying this conversation so much, and it just brings up so many memories for me, Frank, in terms of my own studies in the Dharma traditions, and particularly in yoga and Buddhism and the Jain tradition, because the practices you're describing here just overlap so much with what we've been trained to do in terms of, when people are suffering and they need the compassion and you are feeling compassionate, it's often easier to give that to the people who are suffering and are really kind of asking to be loved and for that compassion. And then when people are not so nice, as you say, and really not even open to to being in that kind of relationship, and instead maybe do the opposite, attack or trigger you or do certain things, it can often be difficult. And coping with that then requires some very skillful self-reflection and work. And as you said, setting at times, it becomes necessary to set the appropriate boundaries, but without ever really truly giving up on them, because every person has a kind of capacity to find this, as you say, this sacred source, I guess you would describe it, and have access to it. So I'm feeling really inspired here towards the end of our discussion. I want to take your course now and study this comparatively through the lens that I've been trained in, and look at it through these monotheistic traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, as you're describing kind of broadly here, to understand how my own practice of compassion can be informed. So thank you so much, Frank, for going through the whole class with me. One of the things I ask often at the end of these podcast episodes when I'm interviewing people about their approaches to compassion and the Compassion Studies Initiative is, I ask each of our expert instructors here, how can our listeners begin to develop more compassion in their lives? Are there any particular pointers or things you would offer in that regard?
Yeah. And as you're kind of sensing it through our conversation, for us, compassion is always like a two-step process. We always begin with, kind of the self-compassion. Am I in that space for openness to compassion, and then cultivating compassion for the other? So I would have a twofold answer. The first one would just be have more kindness towards ourselves when we are resistant to feeling compassion. When we're just tired, or when we're moody, or we find ourselves offended by someone and we don't really want to have compassion, take the time to just have compassion and understanding and befriend our own resistances. And they're there for a reason. There's something that they are aching from us, to be heard and to be acknowledged, and for their needs to be met. So extend compassion to ourselves, even when we feel resistant towards having compassion towards others. And when we are in that best self and open to compassionate connection with others, I would say just take the time to pay attention to another person in their experience. Just pause and take 10 seconds and just be curious. What is this other person really doing in this moment? What are they really feeling? What is going on within them? What is their experience of life? And recognize that whenever anybody is doing something that is distressing, it's rooted in their pain. It's rooted in their suffering. And so what would be one simple act of kindness that we offer to another person, to just let them sense that they've been seen and recognized and met with some dignity and some care? Simple act of seeing another and extending kindness to them.
Well, those are some wonderful words of advice there, Frank. I really appreciate it so much. And I think you did offer so many perspectives on how we could develop compassion in our lives already in this interview, and especially self-compassion and being connected with that true self and sacred source as the source and the root of how we can be more compassionate. So I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners before we sign off here?
Just my deep delight and gratitude, Chris, to be part of this conversation and be offering this class. And I too sense these deep resonances between our spiritual traditions that are just so inspiring to me, and looking forward to learning more about those interconnections. So looking forward to this with a lot of eagerness and gratitude. Thanks, Chris.
Absolutely. And thanks to you, Frank, for talking to me, for taking the time to share these Western perspectives from monotheistic spiritual traditions on compassion. So the title of your course is Spiritual Approaches to Cultivating Compassion. And I think a lot of our listeners are now looking forward to being in that class with you. And we really appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing it come out soon. Thank you so much, Frank.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it too, Chris. More to come.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.